We're going to move on to characters, setting, and plot because our goal is to be able to describe characters in a story, looking at their traits, what motivates them, and how they feel, and then being able to explain their actions and how they contribute to a sequence of events. Now, fictional texts offer the predictability of having characters. They also have settings, which is the time and the place a story takes place. They have a plot structure that is driven by events. These things typically separate fiction and nonfiction texts. While there are exceptions, we generally expect to see these elements in the fiction genres we read. So, let's start with character. We can analyze characters by examining their words, their thoughts, and their actions, or what they say, think, and do. Now, when I closely read through a character lens, it allows me to discover a character's traits. Here's what I discovered as I was reading Little Wolf's Book of Badness. I was a reading detective, and I looked for things in what Little Wolf said. In this book, Little Wolf is the storyteller, and he writes a series of letters to his mom and dad. So it's about the things that he says and in his descriptions. So one of the first things that I found as a detective is he had said, "I know you want me to be wild and wicked like Dad, but why do I have to go so far away?" Well, I can think about what that tells me, and here's a list of some of the common traits. They're adjectives used to describe a character. This particular piece of evidence tells me that Little Wolf is upset, or perhaps he is curious. So I read on, and I find more evidence here, where he says he thinks he's just a goody-goody. "You think I am a goody-goody, I bet. Is that why I have to go away for badness lessons? But I told you I only brushed my teeth last week for a joke, and combing my fur and going to bed early were just tricks to trick you." These things tell me that I think he's in fact a pretty responsible little wolf. If he is brushing his teeth, combing his hair, and going to bed early, those are things we would expect a responsible child to do. What's interesting, though, is that it sounds like it's not pleasing to his parents. As I keep reading on, I find more evidence here. Everybody else thinks I am bad, even if you think I'm a goody-goody four-paws. Remember when Mom was asleep that time and I slipped off her whiskers with the claw clippers? Tells me he's sneaky. And I think he's being very persuasive here, trying to convince his parents that he really is better than maybe they think. The next piece of evidence that I find about Little Wolf is here, where he talks about meeting a Mr. Twister. "Mr. Twister said I was a good worker, and would I stay? I wanted to, but I told him I had to go to Cunning College and study for my bad badge." I think this tells me that he's being obedient to his parents. He's not doing what he wants to do, but rather what they're expecting him to do. And then another piece of evidence comes out here where he says, "But what about learning the 9 rules of badness? If I do not, how will I get a bad badge and keep up the good name of Wolf?" I think here he is probably conflicted and he doesn't know what to do. And so I can examine a character carefully by using evidence of what they're saying, what they're thinking, and what they're doing to reveal their traits. Another way to look closely at a character is through their thinking, their feeling, and their doing in the descriptions of the writer. This is from Walter the Farting Dog. And hear this evidence, he just farted a lot. Well, this is clearly some physical characteristics about the dog that make me think, ew, gross, and describe him as perhaps rude, or maybe he's embarrassed on the other hand. Here, Dad says no matter what he eats, it turns into farts. Again, his physical qualities. If he farts a lot, I can infer that he must be smelly, which probably makes him annoying to others. But as I read on, I get evidence where Walter resolved to hold in his farts forever. This makes me think that he's pretty ambitious. I think Walter is probably very self-conscious of his problem, and he knows he needs to control it. Now over here it says that it's going to be trouble. He's got all this gas in him. He's nervous about it. He's afraid. He's afraid that the house might explode. And this is torture for him. But he's resolved to not let it happen again. So I think that these actions show just how hard he is trying to solve his problem. To me, that shows his trait is determined because it's torture for him. Now what's interesting is then that Walter's problem leads to the big event towards the solution. The family wants to get rid of Walter because he's so smelly. But when a pair of burglars come, this is an event that Walter influences. The burglars come in and they think that Walter is pretty harmless. But Walter can't hold back any of that gas that he's been holding in. He lets a hideous cloud. Knowing that Walter has been trying very hard not to fart, I can just infer how bad this must be. And in fact, I can read some of the clues. They clutched their throats and they were unable to breathe. So these descriptions give me a really strong image of just how bad this is. They have tears in their eyes. So this tells me how bad. It does lead to the burglars being caught because they can't get away. So Walter, in fact, causes the robbers to be caught. So did his action of farting, that problem that he has, actually make him a hero in the end? Perhaps, because the family says you're a good dog, even if you do fart all the time, and they learn to live with him as a hero. His condition and his efforts to not fart cause that event of him exploding on the burglars. And then this results in him being a hero and the family finally keeping him. So Walter's problem and the events that lead up to that final explosive action influence the story. So there are certainly lots of traits about characters. I want to move on to special types of characters here. We have a protagonist, which is our main or leading character in the story, and then an antagonist who opposes or works against the protagonist. Now, while not all plots have antagonists, when they do, those interactions where they affect each other and then their dialogue are all very helpful. I want to use an example from the book Matilda by Roald Dahl. Just to give you a brief idea of this book, Matilda is a sweet, exceptional young girl, but her parents think she's a nuisance. She expects school to be different, but there she has to face Miss Trunchbull, a kid-hating terror of a headmistress. When Matilda is attacked by the Trunchbull, she suddenly discovers she has a remarkable power with which to fight back. It'll take a superhuman genius to give Miss Trunchbull what she deserves, and Matilda may be just the one to do it. Just this piece on the back is evidence that Matilda is in fact the main or the leading character in the story. And then the character that opposes or works against her is Miss Trunchbull. Her parents do as well, but this is the character that then causes the main problem, or what's wrong, or what Matilda needs to overcome, that's going to lead to that solution or how it's solved. But I want to examine some of the dialogue and some of the interactions that really show us the characters. I'm going to go to the chapter, The Weekly Test. In this chapter, Miss Trunchbull visits Matilda's classroom. Her teacher is Miss Honey. If I look right here, Miss Trunchbull comes in and says, "What a bunch of nauseating little warts you are." Everyone had the sense to stay silent. This tells me that Miss Trunchbull, I think, is probably bossy, very cruel, rude, and maybe we can even go on to say that she is evil. The fact that the children have the sense to stay silent does tell me that they're afraid of her. Now, this chapter goes through a lot of dialogue and actions between Miss Trunchbull and different children in the class. She torments and terrorizes them. She's really a bully. But we get to the part here where Matilda speaks up. Without being asked a question, she tells Miss Trunchbull, "I've read it." I think that this shows that she's very brave to speak up to this very obvious bully. However, she does get down here and she hesitates. So it tells me that she is cautious. Now in this story, there are a few problems and solutions, but they all are conflicts between Matilda as the protagonist and her antagonists. She solves her problems because she's brave, she's clever, and because she has that extraordinary talent. So problems or conflicts and their solutions are what lead and contribute to a sequence of events, or what happens in a story. They give the plot a structure. Typically, plots follow a similar basic structure. They have an exposition, a rising action, which tends to be the main part of the story. I think about how I would get on a roller coaster, and the exposition is that beginning part. But the rising action is that slow, time-consuming trip up the hill. There's a lot of anticipation, but you know when you get to the top, you have that sense of it's about to happen. That's like the climax in the story. It's that most intense or exciting part for that protagonist, and often it tends to be that turning point where the plot shifts and heads down. The falling action tends to happen very quickly, just like going down the hill on a coaster. It's the part that follows the climax, and it moves the plot into that final conclusion or resolution, where the conflict is resolved. Usually our lingering questions are answered, and those loose ends are tied up. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use the text, The Name Jar. In the name jar, the basic problem is the little girl Yoonhae is from Korea, and she is embarrassed of her name, so she thinks maybe she needs to pick a name that is American, that the kids will like, and she'll fit in more. We start then with that exposition of the story, where we are introduced to the characters, the setting, and that basic situation. That event that really makes the story possible. Here in the beginning, Yoonhae is going to school for the first day. While on the bus, she has a bit of a flashback where she remembers saying goodbye to her grandmother, and her grandmother gives her a gift. On the bus, Yoonhae is embarrassed, and I know this because it says she felt herself blush, so I can infer that she is embarrassed. The kids are having trouble saying her name. Next comes then that rising action. We've got the basic plot set up. We know Yoonhae is new to America. It's her first day of school. She's embarrassed of her name. So now we've got all of the action to come that's going to build the problem, escalate it a little bit. She goes to her new classroom and she decides not to tell her name. When she gets home and talks with her mom just doesn't seem to understand. As she goes shopping with her mother, they do find Kim's Market, which feels a little bit like back home in Korea. And she meets Mr. Kim, who thinks her name is very fitting. He knows it means graceful. Still, Yoonhae is worried that the American kids won't like her. When she gets to school, she finds that her classmates have created a jar with names in it for her. Now the dialogue here on this page shows that the children are trying to be helpful, and they're putting names in for her. Names that show smart and brave, so those show me that the kids are really being kind to her. She thanks them, and because she smiles, I can infer that this makes Eunhae happy. She has a curious new friend named Joey who wants to know her name, but Eunhae shows him with the stamp from her grandmother. The plot keeps moving along as each day classmates are filling the jar with more names. But then Eunhae gets a letter from Grandma, and she reads it. Now what's interesting here in these last 2 lines is I notice that Eunhae takes her wooden stamp and she fills the paper with it. That tells me she's missing her grandmother because she told Joey that's what she does with her name stamp when she misses her grandmother. The fact that she's thinking for a long time in front of a mirror suggests to me that Eunhae feels conflicted. Her name connects her to her grandmother, but yet she feels like she's not going to fit in or be liked because of her name. And then next, Joey learns Eunhae's name in Mr. Kim's store. This creates a bit of a climax. We're now at the most intense or that exciting part of the story for the protagonist, and it tends to be a turning point. Eunhae comes back to school and the name jar is gone. It's a mystery. The kids don't know where it is. At that point, however, Eunhae says she's ready to introduce herself, which she does, sharing her own name. That quickly, we've reached the climax, and now we're moving into the falling action as we head towards that final conclusion. It seems that the children like her name. Now she finds out later that Joey was the one that took the name jar because he wanted her to keep her own name. And then we get into the resolution. The conflict is resolved. Eunhae is keeping her own name. Any lingering questions tend to be answered and loose ends are tied up. Well, here Joey tells Eunhae that he has his own Korean name, and we find out why he was visiting Mr. Kim. That's where he found out Eunhae's name. He has his own Korean name and stamp, and that wraps the story up for us.